as Daniel told you, I was serving the grounds at Tumamama, and part of my responsibility was to examine the areas around the sanctuary, and one of the areas I had found was a ravine that was available, accessible only by our property, that had a completely archetypal, beautiful, paradise-like, your classic Hawaiian paradise postcard scene in it, with a 32-foot waterfall cascading into a about an acre pool that came together again, serpentined by a large rock, fell another 8 stories into this just awesome, beautiful sight. But it was inaccessible because even where the first pool was 8 stories off of a sheer cliff. And but I was determined to go down there. So I did, found a little crevice and some roots and scurried down there. And it was the most beautiful spot I'd ever been. And I was a naturalist by tendency and trade. And it was the most beautiful spot I had ever seen. And so this is a few days before the Master arrived. And I thought, wow, if ever I could give a gift to the Master, it would be to take him to this spot. Well, a few days later, 22 hours notice, Master Da and the Renunciate Order arrived. And a couple of days later, I was showing one of the Renunciates around the sanctuary. He had been in charge of grounds previously. And we were pointing out different things. He says, oh, you know, I hear there's a beautiful waterfall down this way. I said, oh, I've been to it. He goes, oh, I thought it was inaccessible. I said, oh, no, I've been there, and I want to take the Master there. He says, okay, I'll go in and ask. So he goes in and asks, and the people that were close around the Master who also knew of me or knew me went, no, Master, he's a little crazy. You don't need to do that. No, please don't. So Master said, go check it out. So this fellow comes out again, Mo Whiteside, and he says, okay, show me. So we go off, climb down this tiny crevice, and we're about halfway down. He says, you have got to be insane. You are crazy. There is no way in hell I will ever let you take the Master through such a dangerous, horrible, this is terrible. I'm scared to death. And then he says, but I'm halfway down. I'll go the rest of the way. So he gets down there, and we take a swim, and he looks at this 32-foot waterfall. You know, it's beautiful. And we sit up on this rock. He says, this is the most beautiful spot I've ever been. And I said, yeah, it really is. He says, how are you figuring on bringing the Master down? And I saw him a little opening, and I went, no, I am not a carpenter. Hardly can drive a nail into a 2x4. But I bullshitted myself thoroughly, convincingly. So I thought, well, I'm just going to, right over there, bring a ladder down to here and terrace over to there. And I didn't know what the world I was talking about. So he said, okay. So Ron Mead was a carpenter, also in the support group, and I immediately drug him down there, terrified. And I said, how are we going to do it, Ron? And so he designed it, and immediately the Master wanted to know, when's my ladder ready? Is my ladder ready? Every day. So we worked feverishly, Ron and I did. And 3 weeks later, it was finished. Now, this is an 8-story ladder. They came down 2 stories, went across a plank this wide, an arm's width, so you had to go down to one and go over to the next. Actually, you had to let go of one before you got to the next one. And then that one went down 6 stories, straight drop. And 3 days later, the Master says, early in the morning, I get a message. The Master wants to go down the ladder. So I race down, and I'm going to receive people at the change-off point, and two of the renunciate order come down, male devotees come down first, and the first one says, make sure you offer the master a safety rope, just to be able to offer that. Okay. He goes on down, the next person goes on down, the master looks over the edge and looks at me and just goes, laughs, like, how did I get into this? And but he surrendered to devotees. So he comes off down, and I greet him at the bottom of on this plank. And for those of you who know me and my tendency in history, meeting the master for the first time personally, 60 feet in the air on a plank, was perfect. And so I've been told to offer him a safety rope. So you can't imagine. I'm totally nervous, and so I say, there's a safety. There's a you can, if you want, there's a safety rope over here, and you could put it around you for safety. The master, of course, understands my state thoroughly, and relieves me with his humor. And he looks down at the guys going down below and looks back at me and says, they can do it, I can do it. So I relaxed. And we went down. I assisted the other people in this little scary transition. And we get down to the bottom, and the master performs a puja. Finds a rock, and Shiva Lingam-like rock, and performs a puja. And I'm in charge of the lawn also at this time, and I hear a call from way up above saying, hey Frank, the lawnmower men are here. Our lawnmower's broken, so I had to race up. I was like, at first of course my heart just sank, but then I was truly, thoroughly glad. If that was the only contact I ever had with the master, my heart would be gladdened forever. I was just bright beyond my comprehension by his humor and grace. And so I race up there, race across the lawn, and they brought the long lawnmower. And I went, oh, I'm sorry, that's terrible. And I was gone back down. And I get down to the bottom again, and they had already people in the group had taken a swim. And they were all sitting on the other side of the river. Now this is the North Fork of the largest river in Hawaii. And if those of you who have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the very opening scene where he jumps in the plane and sails off, that's the river. That's where they filmed it. So it's a large river. And so I dive in and swim over to the other side because they motion me over. And I'm like, oh, totally. I was just going to be there as an attendant, but I'm graciously embraced. So I'd done a little homework and explored the area quite thoroughly. Every nook and cranny I'd looked for and made sure people were safe, swimming areas, et cetera, et cetera. And so I proceeded to tell them about the different kinds of rock, and the ancient Hawaiians called this kind of rock male rock and this kind female. And then there was also a corresponding waterfall nearby on the South Fork where the young princes would dive off to prove their manhood. And I relayed this to the group, and the master turns to me and goes, yeah, we're going to do that too. And I went, if you don't mind, I'll just surrender at your feet. And so he received that. And then all of a sudden I said, you can get on top of this rock. And immediately he just stands up and goes, show me. And just like that. It wasn't like, or anything. He just stood up, show me. And I leap upon the rock, scurry up it, and reach down, offer my hand. He reaches up, I pull him up, and he goes and sits on top of the rock, which comes to a natural point. And this rock is about the size of a very small house. But for those of you who know this picture, I'm getting the camera to get it for a second. A-okay? in the beginning of the Fire Gospel and the beginning of the Dreaded Gombu books, there's this picture. So we sat there in silence for 35 minutes. And then he turns back and says, let's take another swim. So we dive in, and I had, like I said, explored, and I'd seen that one of the things that was fun to do was to follow the backwash of this river into right underneath the waterfall and take a ride, literally like a carnival ride downstream. Quite fun. And I swam over and showed them how to do that, and everybody gets into it, taking a few rides. And I had discovered that if you reach up inside the waterfall, just half pounding on you, you can, as far as I could reach, there was a little handhold, just enough to get my fingertips on, and I could pull myself up. And when I pull myself as hard as I could reach up and grab another. Pull myself up on that one and get up on a little ledge. It's about this wide. And get kind of behind and adjacent to the waterfall, and then jump through it. And fun. And so I did that. The master swims right over. Great, beautiful swimmer. Sticks his hand up. So I pull him up, and they kidded me about this for months. Instead of just, pulling him up, sharing space with him, as I got him up, I went, "Here, let me help you." And I could have just easily held his hand, but I grabbed his whole body. "Oh, let me help you." And for months, some people grab me. "Oh, let me help you," and grab my. So, this is thunderous noise, just thunderous. And the master screams at me, he says, "Is this safe, what you just did?" "Yes." And he goes, "There's no rocks down there." "No." And he said, "It's completely safe." And I went, "Yes." And then he goes, "Well, whoopee!" He just screams, throws his body through this waterfall. And it's whoopee at the force of, And I'll always remember this because the light at that particular time of the day, it was morning, came right up the ravine and hit the water. And as all of you have seen water and light together, it's not water and light, it's dancing light. And I'll just have this image forever embedded in my mind of the master screaming whoopee at the top of his lungs, going into this vibrancy. Just fantastic. But I had forgotten to tell him one thing, which was that when you do that, the waterfall pushes you under and holds you there for a second, just long enough you think, "Oh my God, it's bigger than I am." And then as soon as that thought occurs to you, it spits you out, and that's how it feels. And sure enough, he comes spitting out. He looks back up at me like. But he swims right over again, sticks his hand up again, does it again, screams, and wonderful. Everybody comes over, and I'm hauling people up, shooting them through waterfalls. And so then we sit for a little while longer. And he says, "Okay." And we go up. And I'm like in completely transformed and grateful beyond my wildest imagination. Really beyond my wildest imagination. And a little while later, we get an invitation. And Denise and I receive an invitation to come over to the house that night. Mm-hmm. And a couple hours later, somebody else who had helped build the ladder gets an invitation. And a couple hours later, somebody else gets an invitation. And soon, by the end of the day, by the time we actually got over there, everybody had received an invitation to come. And I walk in the door, and the master had just stood up to take a bathroom break. And as he stood up, I walked around the corner. As I walked around the corner, he screamed, "Hanumanji!" And I just... top of his lungs, and I had been initiated into this force. And he left the room, and they ushered to have me sit down in front of him, in front of his chair, which was actually just a pillow on the floor. in this small, literally a breakfast room, adjacent to the kitchen. And so I sat down. Now, that was the first of many names Master Da gave me. Also, he named me Frank, or Frankie, which means little free boy. He named me, I think the next name was Garbage Man. The next day was Repugno. And his favorites were Jungle Jock and Monkey Man. And although I was Hanumanji for a glorious little few-week period, he comes back, sits down, looks over at me. Ah, this is a fellow who can recite for hours. He has the photographic memory. And I can just see it coming. And I go, oh no, I don't have a photographic memory. So, oh, that's what I've heard. You have a photographic memory. Frank, he can recite the teaching for hours, I hear. And I go, no, I don't have a photographic memory. He says, well, how do these stories arise? I went, well, I do have a good memory. He says, well, that's what I've heard. I've heard you can recite the teaching for hours. He says, how do you do it? And I said, well, occasionally I see a book or see a page in front of me and recite. He says, that's photographic. And I go, yeah. And he says, well, we're having a new book come out, and I'll recite one of the poems from it, and then you can recite it for us. Show us all your wares. I said, and stupidly agreed to this, and foolishly, maybe not stupidly, but foolishly. Actually, it was a wonderful way to play. And he said this one, which as you all hear as the poem is constructed. I tried the first couple times to actually do this. I often think of buying a cane. After all, my left side is weak, but I never bought one at all. And thus I often seem to walk, inclined to my weakness and my weaker side. Sometimes I limp. Perhaps I should take an injury and then indulge myself in an ebony walking stick with an ivory or amber hand, or else a white or silver one with a carving in the end to rest my hand. I don't know how or if I'll manage it, but all the time, and by these means, I keep a mind for my weaker side, and limped, or stood upon a cane. I'll keep you mindful of it too. So I bumbled through the first couple lines, and he says, you want another chance? I went, oh yeah. And so he reads it again, and then trying to stall for time, I went, oh, photographic memory means I look at it. He goes, oh, of course. Hands me the thing, and this goes on for about an hour. After about an hour, he says, well, let's have it. Either you can do it or you can't. And I said, I don't think I can do the first line. And he painted a perfect picture of my social involvement in doing recitations, because often people would read the teaching at the beginning of gatherings, and I would trot myself up there and do recitations. And so he said, how did these rumors get started? And looked at me just at a glance, like, I hear these things. Frank, he can recite the teaching for hours. He says, where do these rumors come from? And I was starting to get it. And I was starting to burn. And knowing that he was pointing to this egoic involvement I had in it, of being very proud of it. And he went on and on. The rumors, on and on, how this could have happened. Never saying, oh, well, obviously you've jerked yourself around with this, right? He was very gracious, very humorous, and just utterly gracious, in fact. But letting me know what I was up to, self-understanding. And then he says, fortunately, someone to the left of him rescues me, says, Master, I've heard him. He can recite the teaching for hours. And the master turns to him and says, and then he turns back to me and says, is this true? And the guy goes, and so I recite this for him. if I can remember it. The conditions of experience are summarized in the teaching. The summary of conditions is a summary or circle of pairs of contradictions. When the whole affair of arising is clearly seen, it is felt to be an irreducible dilemma. Experience in itself is futile, unrelieved, contradicted. Therefore, we are moved to the principle of freedom. Experience for the devotee duplicates a field of contradictions, even in the case of realization of truth, except that the devotee has realized the paradoxical nature of all pairs. When contradiction becomes paradox, the strife of time and space becomes overwhelmingly beautiful, and the devotee begins to contemplate in the humor of our God. And the Master, again, reflecting me back to myself, goes, "Did I write that?" And this childlike, look on his face, he goes, "I wrote that?" And starts stroking his chest hairs and goes, and turns to Boda and says, "I wrote that." And says, "Yes, Master." He goes, "God, I write good shit." And again, he asks me, he says, "I wrote that," and then I got it. What I was doing, I had claimed it as my own, in my feeling. And he says, I said, "Yes, God, I write good stuff, don't I?" In other words, he was the source of it, not my claiming of it in any kind of way. And he says, "Well, I'll give you one more chance, Hanuman. This time, you need not be so left-brain attentive. Just receive what I'm going to communicate to you." And in such a way, he signaled to me that I need not try to get it and prattle it back, doing my little game, but receive a transmission on the basis of this understanding. And he read this poem, which I will read to you. He read it line by line, and every line he looked up and looked at me directly in the eyes until I had gotten it. Slowly read a line and look up at me. And he'd look at the line and look up and read it to me and hold my gaze until I understood. He felt that understanding. And I'll do the first few lines to give you a feeling, and then I'll read the rest of the poem. Every body is an island for its one. The eye, adrift in space, is masted to its earth core. The body bright, rising slightly on the ocean and the currents of life light. A single tree is also rising there, antenna to the sky of mind, a plant of nerves, its root insects in foliated brain. That tree surveys the earth and sky, the mindful scene, the move of life, and would uncapture this attentive eye. How can this island fly or drown? To what space can space be gone? The I will be forgotten when the source of I is found. And he just held my gaze. The I will be forgotten when the source of I is found. And he held my gaze. And he held it until I was also in a transcendental point of view relative to my own tree of life and foliated brain, root and sex, isle. And then he held my gaze more until I was abiding with him in transcendental God consciousness. And I just we held each other in that transmitted to me embrace and he says, "Did you get it?" I said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, good, you can recite it for us all." Immediately test me, here I am, here he is, exploded me, self. And then all of a sudden, And I said, oh, I didn't mean I got it that way. And he says, oh, anybody can do that other stuff. I want to hear your stuff. I want to hear your thing. Fortunately, I was saved by Boda once again. He called me to recite some more. But as I was preparing this presentation earlier in the week, I realized for the first time, this was an hour period, and he had initiated me with his spiritual name, initiated me with his force and his humor. He had served me with my understanding of this social personality and enlightened me in the way that he did, and then tested me all in an hour. And this was the first of thousands of hours. This was the first hour of a 6-month, 6 to 12 hours nightly, almost nightly, ordeal, embrace with him. I also wanted to tell you very quickly how one last Leela before I left, only a few days before I left to my mama. I had gone to Honolulu to do some court business, and after the end of the day I'd slept in a strange place, and I had nightmares all night long. And they were tormenting, nightmares. And it was agonizing. I was exhausted. And about 3 a.m., one of the nightmares got me. And I woke up and called his name. Master. Just in fear, just woke up and said that. And I realized where I was. And I looked over the clock, and it was 3:05. And I went trying to figure out how much more of this night torment I was going to have to endure. And I said, okay, it's an hour and a half. The psychic would change with the rising light. Rolled back to sleep. And when I went back to sleep, I immediately fell into a dream state, and the master came. And he sat down. He said, you can put your head on my knee. And as I did that, he put his hand on my head in the way he had done several other times in the waking state. And it was identical to that. And that is, there is this profusion of love, bliss, force, grace, just rushing through the body. And I noticed that there was something interfering with the free flow of this love bliss, this love ananda. And my vision internally in the body mind was drawn to where this was obstructed, where it was being perturbated. And I saw there was just little things sticking in the body that were making little interferences with this free flow of bliss. And I noticed that those were my own anxiety, my own contraction. The body was made by the house of Narcissus by my own contraction. But I noticed this not as an insight like, oh, I'm uptight, or oh, I'm neurotic, or oh yes, I'm just doing this to myself. It wasn't that. It wasn't that way. It was in the face of this love that I noticed how I was obstructing it. In the face of satsang, what I was doing to interfere with it. And so it was obvious. I relaxed. I didn't do that anymore. And I'd been served once again in hearing. And when I did that, the obstructions fell away, and there was only free flowing bliss or seeing. And I slept like a baby the rest of the night. The next morning, Tom Closser comes to pick me up. He had been on all-night attendant duty, and we're driving back to the sanctuary, and he turns to me halfway there. We're riding silently, and he says, oh, where were you right after 3 o'clock last night? And I turned to him and go, why? He says, well, the master woke up, called out to the house, the attendant shack, wanted to know where you were. And I said, well, I had a nightmare and I woke up and called his name. He goes, oh, right. Ordinary, you know. And so we got to go over to the master's house that afternoon. And I told him this story. And he said, yes, I heard you. That was me. I was glad to do that for you. He says, but I don't want to always just get you out of trouble. I want you to use me for much, much more. And I felt all that, his embrace as well as his charge. And a little while later, my knees were hurting. And a very short time later, my knees were hurting, and I got up and walked to the other side of the room so I could stand at the back rear and relieve my knees. And at this point, it was a break when I did that, and there was people walking back and forth and music going on, and I suddenly, then when it hit me, what had happened. I'd woken up 150 miles away in the middle of the night, called out this person's name, and he wakes up and blesses me and heals me. I'm like, what kind of person is it that does this? And I was just, beside myself, and I suddenly started recognizing him. And I realized there's another quote that started going through my mind, which he says, "I am the answer to human prayers, not superhuman intent." And I realized that was true. And if that's true, I was in the company of something I could not even fathom. And in the midst of people going back in front of me and music and things happening out of my lips in terms of recognition, but it was only to myself, I just whispered in recognition, "Master." And his head was actually turned at the time, getting something. What? And this was equally as miraculous to me at the moment than the Honolulu. And I fell back and I said, "I want to give you a hug." He said, "Sure." And I walked across the room, slightly tripped at the last, fell into his arms. And he embraced me for a long time. And held me, kissed me on one cheek, kissed me on the other. And then he held my head, kissed me in the mouth, and held my face right in front of him. And just looked at me in the eyes, just utter lovingly, just giving himself up, utterly. And I said, "Thank you." He said, "Joe." And I wanted to tell you that, how grateful I am that he's done all of this for us. Duh.